the spending through it and the budgets into it, and the profits go back to the state. So there are technical differences, but we'll be dealing with that in October, and we need to get moving on it. The other thing that we need to do is look at an alternative currency, because if money is being removed from our society, what are we going to use? And now's the time to confront it. And it's something that we've been asking ourselves in the credit union movement. And this is something that the credit unions should actively look at as well, because a lot of our members have no bank accounts. And the other thing is, if you get into financial difficulty with your mortgage, the bank will close all your bank accounts anyway. And you can't get a bank account. So the issue of electronic fund transfer is a problem. John, I'm sorry.
We can come back to those questions in a short time anyway, James. Our fourth last speaker is Jamie Dowling, who comes from Éire Bank, and this is essentially what Éire Bank is. Having fallen victim to an engineered economic recession, the creators of Éire Bank embarked upon an investigative path to discover what had happened and what they could do about it. The path led from conspiracy theory to activism to protest, and eventually back to activism in a way. They discovered in order to make a change in the circumstances, they would just have to do it themselves as ordinary people, because if they were to wait for someone else or something else to fix things, they'd be waiting. The product of all this discovery was Éire Bank. Jamie Dowling, thank you.
Thanks very much, John. Firstly, I just want to start off by saying thanks to everybody for coming down tonight. I'm not sure what everybody's expecting, but hopefully you get something from the night. Basically, what I want to do to explain what Éire Bank is just ask a few questions, and you might just get a hands up or a yes or something, just to let us know. How many people have a mortgage? And how many people are actually working full time? Okay. Does anybody here have an imaginary friend? Just one person? That's unusual, because if we think about it, isn't it a company, an imaginary person? And yet we give all the control of almost every facet of our society to imaginary people. And there are millions of them running around the country. We're looking at them on billboards, and we're looking at them on television. And they're confusing us and distracting us all the time. But they're not really doing much for us except taking our money. And that's where the thinking of Éire Bank is stemming from. And to explain what Éire Bank is, I just want to use a simple analogy that we came up with. For example, a crossword. I presume everybody has probably done a crossword at some stage. And you get to the end of the crossword and you complete it, and you feel a sense of accomplishment, and you've done something, the clues fit, and you're happy with yourself. But sometimes you come to a crossword that you can't finish, and you're not sure why, because you know you're pretty intelligent, and you're looking at the clues, you're looking at everything that you've put in so far, and you think, where have I gone wrong? And then you suddenly realise that maybe there's something wrong with the crossword itself. And that's how easily somebody becomes a conspiracy theorist. Maybe there's something wrong with the crossword. But surely there couldn't be. You know, the crossword has been going for ages, and people are doing the crossword every day. But when you're talking to your friends, some of them can't seem to finish the crossword either, and they don't really know why. So you decide to write a letter then to the editor, and you'll ask him to change his crossword around to make it so that people can finish it, because the clues are not written. But the editor just ignores your letter, and you're thinking, why is he ignoring the letter? I'm trying to help him fix his crossword. But what we don't realise is that the editor is making money from his crossword, and with us in a perpetual cycle, we're not actually getting anywhere, but he's taking all our money. So from there, then you decide, I'll make a big sign, and I'll stand outside his place of work, and shout slogans at him, and that'll make him change his crossword. But after a while, then you realise that people are just walking past you while you're doing that, and they're telling you to stop blocking the roads, I need to get home and do my crossword. But what's going on? They don't know what you're doing, you're trying to help them and help yourself. But then you think to yourself, this is not working, we'll have to do something else. What can we do? Like, you know, he's not going to fix the crossword for us. So you decide then on the way home, maybe we should make our own crossword. And we can just, between all of us, no nobody knows every part of the crossword, but we know it works when everybody knows a little bit of the crossword. So we put a new crossword together, and all of a sudden, the editor is coming to us and wondering why are we not buying these crosswords anymore. And we just said we're not too pushed. We have our own crossword. And eventually you just see like that's how simple it is. But if we actually replace the word crossword with the words social and economic system, then it seems really difficult again, because what we understand to be a social and economic system is pretty much all imaginary. It's not actually real. And another problem we have is that the fear we have is also imaginary. It's not actually anything real that we can do. It's just a feeling that's been provoked by watching RTE telling us that doomsday here and doomsday there, and promissory notes, as John said earlier on, and we just can't listen to it anymore. So when we replace the word social and economic system with the word Éire Bank, it's a very small, very basic crossword that we can all do. And we're issuing our own interest-free money, that we don't have to pay banks almost half of everything in society. The privilege of sitting there and having a fancy calculator and typing numbers into our accounts. We can actually start to build our own platform, and we can take one step onto the new platform, simultaneously just look in through the door, see what's around, build a platform, and then actually step in with the other foot and leave the old system behind, because it is actually that simple when you break it down. And people did laugh a little when I asked if anybody had an imaginary friend, but that's how ridiculous this whole situation is. And we're letting these people get away with it. And we're adult human beings. Why don't we just stand up, do it ourselves? We don't need permission. Why would we ask permission of people who are taking all our money and literally trying to enslave us? So the fact is we actually don't need banks, because all the banks do is keep score of our exchanges. They don't actually add anything to society at all. They take almost half of everything in society, which is half of all of our wealth, all of our cumulative wealth, which is a massive drain on our society. And as a result of that, 2 people every day in this country are taking their own lives because of pressure. And I just think the time for talk is finished, and we can do something about it. Thanks.
Thanks, Jamie. I just want to ask a question of, I suppose, all 4 in a sense, trying to bring everything together, because it just strikes me this conversation that is going on for 5 years out there in RTE and elsewhere, which is trying to normalise every day, to normalise a certain version of what's happening. And yet, you know, the indicators from different directions are of increasing desperation from within the system. You know, not just austerity, but you know what James described there, this move on the credit union system and their pot of gold that's there. Every pot of gold, or little pot of gold that's there, they're going after. At the same time, you know, without necessarily understanding or thinking through all the things, I have this fear that you can't really, what Jamie's suggesting there, it sounds extraordinarily inspiring, but what can we do? Because it's almost like these solutions are almost post-apocalyptic, that you have to wait for the meltdown and the catastrophe to happen before you can actually make a move. And I just wonder, can we think through, we do this might happen, then we do this. What is the process by which we get to reason, to a reasonable way of understanding? First of all, and to educating people about all this stuff is important as well. So you have to somehow move around the conversation to get to them. What is the process? Have you thought through, Jenny, what should happen, what might happen, what could happen, and what's at stake, what's involved for us as ordinary citizens who really don't know what to do?
Yeah, well, basically, we don't need permission to try and solve our own economic crisis, which we didn't create in the first place. So what we need to do is take a step, a first step, because we won't get anywhere if we talk for another 5 years. We get nowhere. So the first step is to basically, in my opinion, create a new currency, which is the basis then for us to build on that. And as the lads have said, the currency is nothing but numbers nowadays. It's not tied standard. So what we need to do is set up a medium of exchange that people accept and that people have faith in, and maintain the integrity of the transfer and of the issuance of that money. Because basically it's not money, it's just numbers. It's a scorecard basically for our exchanges. And once we do that, we can build on that, and we don't have to say we're not in this society anymore. That's a bit far-fetched. But what we can do is we can build a platform, and we can start with the first step, and we can say to ourselves, look, we need to do something. We can't keep going. We can't wait for government to do it, because they're not going to. The banks are certainly not going to do it. So if we just set up a very simple, very basic platform of exchange that we can build faith in, and we can spread around the country to voluntary committees of our own members, which is what the Éire Bank is all about. That everybody who joins is a member, has a say in what goes on, and if they want to be on a committee that facilitates that, that'll be an honour for that person. It's not a career. They're not going to retire after 2 years on 2 or 3 pensions, but they can give back and contribute to society.
Can you protect that from state encroachment? I mean, I remember, 20 years ago, before the Celtic Tiger, things were pretty bad, had been pretty bad through the 80s, and there was still a lot of kind of talk about the mess we were in. And there was a lot of this kind of talk around the country, and there was a brilliant guy called Richard Douthwaite, a green economist, who had really formulated a lot of thinking. He died a couple of years ago. Very brilliant guy. And he had actually set up a currency in Westport, the let system. But the big issue then was, before the Celtic Tiger came along, which kind of disposed of it all anyway, because of course all the problems had been solved by the Celtic Tiger. But the fear then was that there would be encroachment, that by virtue of the let system working in, say, in Westport, where if you were a carpenter, you could do some carpentry work for the butcher, and you could do an exchange based on that. But that the government then the state started to become interested in that as economic activity, which was taxable. So you're into the state. How do you stay out of that cycle if they're sniffing around for every euro they can find?
It's a very interesting point, all right, because I suppose if we think back, we kind of sit on the laurels of 1916 a lot, even though it bought us a little bit of freedom for a little while. We just became enslaved again thereafter. But I don't think they asked for permission to have a rising at that stage. So I don't think we really need to ask for permission, because we're the ones who are suffering from this, and we're human beings just the same as these people who are hiding behind these imaginary people who are trying to enslave us. And they're actually just parasites. That's all they are actually doing. And until we stand up and defend ourselves against that, we won't get out of it. And I do think the government will try, if something like this gets off the ground, they will try to have a hand in it. But I think if they do, that it'll fail because of that. But I think if we can just say, no, this is ours, this belongs to the people, it doesn't belong to government, because the government belongs to the people. Although it doesn't seem that way, because we actually, at the minute, we do live in an elected dictatorship. We can't say any different, because I heard a ruling a short while back there that apparently a citizen doesn't have any standing to challenge Parliament, and Parliament again is another imaginary person. So who are we actually trying to challenge? We're trying to challenge a very small group of people who are using imaginary entities to instill fear in us that we don't need and we can live without.
Paul, how do you see that? I mean, is this something that you kind of prepare? Is it a preparation for some kind of catastrophe, some kind of meltdown, and then you step in with another proposed solution? Or is there another process that we should be pushing forward with right now to obviously alert people, to educate people, but in practical ways to put the alternative system in place?
Yeah, well, in terms of promoting our solution and so on, we try to do things on several different fronts. Sort of grassroots level stuff like this. I've also met with various politicians and economists and journalists and so on. And really what we're trying to do is just educate about the present system and the knock-on effect from that, you would imagine, is that people would say, okay, this just is unsustainable, can't go on, let's start discussing alternatives. And I've met with various economists who say, well, this is the way the system works and so on, and ultimately they kind of debate back with me and suggest that no, the best thing to do here is just keep the system going. And I know we're all trying to change the system here now, and that's a very, very difficult job, but I actually think we have a slightly easier job than anyone who's trying to keep this system going. It's just so unsustainable. I have a very mathematical brain. I just look at a graph of the money supply going back so many decades, extrapolate from that, realise how unfeasible that is, and think ultimately something's got to give,
What are you finding from talking to politicians? How would you describe the level of knowledge, understanding of the political and or the journalistic class and or the economist class? How much have they thought through this issue?
Well, I'd be very technical about things, and I'd understand the accountancy procedures, particularly within banks and that. So certainly all the mechanics of the monetary system are very misunderstood, really. And I've met with several politicians who just don't realise how directly banks create money. And I haven't met just with any politician, I've met with the ones that have an economics background, really. And still the level of knowledge of particularly the structure of money through loan repayments is just non-existent, really. I've met with several prominent economists as well, and it's the exact same thing, and I see that as a little window of opportunity, really. If I'm coming along and saying, there's this whole big thing that you didn't realise about the destruction of money and the creation of money and so on, and if they sort of feel humble after our conversation, perhaps then they'll sort of look at alternatives and think, perhaps I just didn't know so much and so on, and perhaps it's now time to look at the fundamentals of, in particular, money creation and how it affects things, and how you can't particularly resolve the debt crisis under the present system as it is, I mean, to date, I've met with so many of them and they've taken on board, so to speak, and they're politely wish me the best and so on. And then the following week I read an article where they just back to the generic end of things, I forward various articles to them. There are people writing about this stuff. About once a month or so, something comes up in either the Guardian or articles that you've written and so on, and forward that, and with the hope that that will lead them. The more and more that they see these things, the more they might write about it themselves.
Carl, what do you think is necessary? Or, I mean, how do you see this question of, because we seem to be kind of caught with a diagnosis which is a misdiagnosis, which everybody believes in, which everybody focuses on. So there's no catalyst to get us to the point where we realise there's a different problem and that it can be fixed.
Yeah, so and that's exactly what's going on. It's a misdiagnosis, and if you misunderstand what the problem is, all your solutions are going to be wrong. So that's what's going on today. Like the government will tell you, oh, they're doing really well with all their austerity. And to them, success is to be able to exit the bailout, which on the face of it sounds really good. Oh yeah, we get away from this whole EU, IMF, ECB thing. But what does that mean when they're exiting the bailout? It means they're going to go back to the markets. So that means that the government is going to be borrowing money again at interest. Instead of borrowing it from the IMF, they're going to be borrowing it from the markets, as if that were a good thing. But that's actually just the entire problem, is that banks are creating money and loaning it not only to mortgages, but they're mortgaging this country because the government's borrowing money off them. So that's like, that's the issue. The very few, and you don't hear this in the mainstream media, where people say, what's at the basis of all this? That discussion doesn't come up. That needs to happen. We need to understand what's interest, why is it being charged, is there a way of doing it without charging interest? And then if we can have that discussion, then the solutions, although we might differ on the details of how to roll it out, we might be moving forward into that, where we're going to, okay, let's create a money system without interest, see how that goes.
Yeah, and I mean, I suppose that there's a kind of fatalistic thinking here in Ireland whereby at the very best what you get is there's a kind of a sneaky hope that the entire global system will collapse and all the pressure will be off then because something will have to be done. But it doesn't seem from what you're saying, Paul, it doesn't seem that there's any kind of place, any point in the system that is weakening, that is softening on the question of saying, look, we need to do something within our system because this doesn't work, this is not going to work, we should be taking lead. Is there any place that you see where we could go into this, whether it's media, whether it's politics, whether it's the economic profession, and start doing something? Or can you do it from out there? It seems improbable that you can, Jamie and you, Carl, and that you can actually go on the internet, whatever, set up something that will actually have that kind of power to change. Or is that?
Well, I think it's possible.
Yeah, well, again, I'm all about the statistics and so on, and just realizing how unsustainable the present system is, and keep coming back to it. Ultimately, I think something's to give. But I am amazed, on irisheconomy.ie, all the Irish economists just post various things, and you're allowed to comment on it. But there seems to be no change in mentality. I've been on that forum for the last 2 or 3 years or so, and everything just seems to be about getting the system going, getting banks lending again, and so on. And occasionally you see something up there about alternatives to austerity, and they're just so unimaginative. It's absolutely amazing. The other thing about it is, even when all the statistics roll in, unemployment statistics, and even the fact that debt to GDP ratios in general are increasing, does that not show how completely unsustainable the system is, mathematically speaking? And still, there just seems to be no shift in mentality within the mainstream economics profession. I just don't have the answer really as to when it might shift, but I think it has to.
Yeah.
Sorry,
No, I just wanted to add in there. I understand what we're saying about Éire Bank is it's very idealistic from an initial point of view, but in fact the website that we built for it is going to be ready by the end of the month, and it's pretty much a combination of a Facebook account with a PayPal account. So basically, it's a secure system where you can go in and purchase something from another member instantly from your account, which will be pretty much a social network. You don't have any obligation to do anything. You can join up and just network on our site. But if you want to actually purchase something, you have the credit there to do it.
James, I just want to ask you a question, James, about the credit union movement, because historically the credit union movement was this in a different form. It was an alternative system. And what appears to have happened now, I don't entirely understand, because apart from people like yourself, a few people like yourself, the whole movement seems to have lain down under this grab. And I don't quite understand why it is that the people who were idealistically behind starting up this alternative money system and giving it a really great service to people over many, many decades are now quietly allowing the government and the central bank to nobble them.
It's a problem that we're seeing at board level, and even to raise it at board level, it raises concern among the members themselves, the directors. And I suppose you really have to look at the type of people that are on boards. A lot of them are very conservative people, and their attitude when you raise the risk with them at the time of investment is there's nothing we can do about it. They feel very vulnerable that they've no control. They have to go along with directions and directives. And if they speak out, they're afraid that they'll be targeted by the central bank. And in the case of Newbridge Credit Union, the central bank, through their solicitors, served gagging orders on the directors that they couldn't talk in public. And the only one that spoke, that wrote a letter to the media, was Breda Reid, I think. And she published that letter. And the next day she had another solicitor's letter from the solicitor's firm that works for the central bank. So it's a major problem. They're all scared at the moment, and I suppose maybe the fact I'm retired and I'm not concerned about that risk. They can lodge me in jail and go on if they want, it doesn't really bother me. But there's very few of us, there's only about 2 or 3 directors in the country prepared to talk about this issue. And going back to one of your questions there, the whole banking system needs to be looked at. And we're not going to get anything happening from the top down because there are so many vested interests in banking. It has to come from us, from the people, from the bottom up. It's us that will affect change. Don't expect others to do it. It has to come from us. And when you look at 2010, before the last election, there was 550 billion euros in savings accounts, banks, building societies, credit unions, and on bust. When Fine Gael came into power, they released the figure was down to 97 billion. Now, that's a lot of money to take out of the country within 1 year. And we were supposed to be a very wealthy country, but from what I see, that 550 billion was made up of corporate companies, mostly American companies here, that moved the money out prior to the election. And then you see a guy in Intel, a top accountant, who gets an international award for moving money and not having any money held in Ireland overnight in case the euro goes. And that still applies to this day, where American companies don't hold any euro value here in Ireland. It's moved to America overnight. Like, that affects banking seriously.
Okay, at this stage I think we'll open up to the floor. If anybody wants to ask any questions of anybody in the panel or come back on any point that have been raised. Yes, gentleman. Here.
Yeah, Tony Simpson is my name. I think I spoke to yourself, John, in the early 90s about when you wrote your first article on LED systems in a pub here in Dublin. We met and we were discussing it. But when I had set up the very first LED system conference with Richard Dowglade in the early 90s. Now, a number of them started up and some of them failed. And I do feel, as a couple of the speakers have said, you do have to come back to local at some stage, community-based. Now, again, I have a lot of concerns. I've been asked by a number of groups around the country to go and help set up LED systems again. And I have asked them to do basic things like a skills survey of their community to see are there enough transferable skills to be able to operate the system, and they haven't done so. Now, in America, and there are a number of systems running very successfully in the United States and other countries now, and places like Brixton, the Brixton Pound in London, Totnes, with the Transition Towns movement. But I do feel that what Paul has said, and I've been at Paul's conferences, politicians and economists in Ireland are not interested. And conferences like this are great, and I think the word should go out as often as possible. It doesn't have any major media effect on the economists. I've written to them myself, asking them on their websites, do they understand how money is created? They don't. They don't get it. And they don't get this idea of negative interest or no interest. They just don't get it. And so I think you have to look at the successful experiments that have been done and are still running around the world. For example, in Switzerland, there was one set up in 1934 called the Wirtschaftsring, and it's still going to this day. It's an alternative currency. You can look it up on the web, WIR, Éire Bank. They have a banking, they have lots of banks now. And it is not transferable into Swiss franc. Each VIR is equal to the Swiss franc. They transact, since about billions. And when the Swiss economy is doing badly, transactions in VIR go up. When the Swiss economy is doing well, the transaction in VIR go down and the Swiss franc goes up. You can look at them. But one of them that excited me, and Richard Delphi got somebody over from Ithaca in New York, in upstate New York. They are integrated with the credit union there. It is called Ithaca Hours, and it's been going about 25 years or more. And it's, again, a lot of these things are trying to do at a local level what the speakers have been saying. But I think at the end of the day, it has to be community-based. The credit union movement in this country is very strong in the sense of membership and control. And it is a pity that the board of directors are conservative, as James said. And I do feel that if we could get something going with the backing, even an experimental one, of a credit union movement, because don't forget the credit union movement was criticised. When it started up in Ireland, the bank said it will never last because ordinary people would not know how to run them. And it's been a major success in the normal money system. The credit unions have been. So I would hope that some radical credit union or local community-based one will start up and run a parallel currency in whatever town or wherever it is in Ireland to show that it works. Because after all, we have lots of skilled people with all sorts of knowledge and skills and abilities to do things, and they are not able to transact any of those skills because they don't have the money. And so therefore, you do what the gentleman said, you invent your own money. And it needs to be done in a very constructive and efficient way, and the software is now available, mainly from the Netherlands, where you can do the transactions on a mobile phone. And Richard Doubtway told me just shortly before he died that the Lisbon Treaty prevents you setting up an alternative currency, but that if you do it through mobile and other means of transactions, you can overcome the problems of the Lisbon Treaty.
Thank you very much.
I would like to come in there, Mr. Waters. There are one elephant in the room which hasn't been mentioned. Jamie mentioned the 1960 rebellion, 26 years ago. For anyone to believe that we can have a serious change and revolution in our financial situation without a war, they're living in cloud.
Absolutely.
There has to be, and I know Julie has talked about that, but there is no way will the vested interests that now run the world, not just Ireland, but run the planet, the Rothschilds and their like, that own the central banks, that own our central banks, Queen of England who owns the central bank of the UK. They are not going, they have these things called police forces and jail cells. As this gentleman mentioned, he says, the directors of the credit unions are threatened with prosecution. Well, that's guards coming to your front door and putting you behind bars. So unless people are prepared and told that the only way this will change is by blood on the streets, and that, sorry, I don't have to. The second thing I would like to add to that, this gentleman said, about currency, new currency. With the rise of the internet, Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies of that ilk will do for independent currencies what email did to Amazon. And the gentleman talking from the credit union looking for a separate currency. If the credit union movement in Ireland were to totally adopt the Bitcoin as a currency and invest it and take it on independent of funding, like as what happened in Greece when the EU tried to take the millions and millions, the trillions that are bogey money that's in Greece, they just converted it to bitcoins. That accounted for the massive rise in Bitcoin, which is now yesterday $115 per Bitcoin or whatever. So the credit union movement in Ireland could avail, and that could be the revolution, could avail of Bitcoin, cryptocurrency, and really give the government a go.
I'll call us to come back, and then I'll come to the lady in front, and then just maybe
Thanks very much, John. I'm delighted to attend tonight's meeting. I'm actually a local election candidate in the local elections, but Wayne Flanagan Tobin is my name. I'm running the Pembroke South Dock, and I'm very impressed with the meeting here tonight. But the problem is that I bring some of the issues here tonight to the doorsteps of the Pembroke South Dock region, which includes a lot of South Dublin region, where at the moment people will think I'm gone a little bit bananas. And what I will say is that I'm very disappointed with the credit union movement and the speaker from the credit union movement, James. And I want to say, why have the credit union movement not gone out and protested as directors, James, I'm not sure what funding you receive or whether it's paid or voluntary position. I'd like you to clarify that right now here, please, in front of the audience. But what I will say is, I am disappointed that the credit union movement has not gone out in force, because it seems to me like the credit union movement is a little bit of a clique. So what I would say is, I'm very disappointed with the credit union movement, which was set up as a cooperative. And I'm looking at the ideas of microfinancing, taking on board everything is said here, but I don't see the idea of a new currency being a realistic alternative to the people, which I will be meeting on the doorstep today, tomorrow, and the next day. And James, I would like you to address the point why you and directors such as you have not gone out and protested, raised this issue. You have the opportunity tonight in front of a small meeting. Fair enough, fine, you're here as a person, but why can you not bring other directors on force with you? What is the problem with those other directors that they will not come on board? Because to be honest with you, James, a new currency, all of what we're talking about tonight is hogwash. Because we're not going to have a new currency. So I would like you to address the question as why the credit union leaders will not, no, I will finish, will not follow suit. You sit down. Will not follow suit. Thank you.
Okay, if James can come back on that, and then I want to call, and I'll talk to come to the lady in front then, okay? So James, if you can respond to that.
There are a few questions here, but I'll take the simple one first. I am a volunteer. There's no director head, or you don't even get your expenses. And I didn't look for the job. There were several of us approached the community as we went into the credit union to see if we'd volunteer, because the problem was nobody wanted to fill the vacancies as a result of the 2012 Act. Nobody wants to. The other thing as well is that once a month we have to give a full day to training on money laundering, risk management, a whole pile of practices and procedures, and that's a lot of time to give up as a volunteer, plus some evenings as well. The other thing is we did arrange about 3 weeks ago an awareness day at the central bank. 35 people showed up at it. We sent emails to several thousand people around the country. People came from Kerry, Galway, Roscommon, Kilkenny, Carlow. We had representatives from most counties. But even my own board of directors all turned up for the day's training rather than come into the central bank. So you have a problem. And it boils down to, I think, the fact, as I said earlier on, that most of the people on boards of credit unions are conservative people. They're teachers, they're bank managers, they're people respected within the community that put themselves forward. And they don't want to rock the boat, but they need to look at where the credit union movement is going. And I fear that we may not have a credit union movement in a year's time. If the government and the banks get their will, it will severely restrict us and remove us even further from the community, because the bigger you make us, the more insular we become. And the problem that you highlighted there becomes even greater.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Carl wants to come in, I think, on what Derek was saying there in the front.
Yeah, it's just to say that, and it also brings in what the other gentleman was saying about the other currencies that are around there, because this awareness has grown of what has actually happened around the world. Actually, I brought some books out here. One gentleman in Kerry Bolton, he wrote a book about all the different alternative currencies that we set up over the years, and it's been done before. Even in French Canada, at one time, the king didn't send over any francs, so the governor made money out of cut up playing cards, and it worked. And in the Middle Ages in England, they had tally sticks, which were sticks marked off and split down the middle and issued as money, and that worked too. So alternative currencies have worked and will work. What I wanted to say though is that this is really doable to actually launch alternative currencies now. Jamie's working with others on the Éire Bank. I'm working with Anthony Michels on something similar but different. But it is possible to have local currency and get it launched, get people involved, have it happening. The one I'm working on actually has convertibility. which is very important because there's been this idea that well, people won't accept it. But if you have a currency with convertibility with an online marketplace, which is like Bitcoin, but it's not Bitcoin, but you have convertibility there, it's wonderful because you can bring business in, because you can tell them that if they do need to pay euro invoices, there's an opportunity for them to go on the online marketplace if they need some euros and not just the local currency. So this is a wonderful opportunity to bring back a lot of the things that have been mentioned here, the model of Bitcoin with the online marketplace, the software that's been developed by a voluntary group in Holland, which they're already using in Brixton. You can pay with your mobile phone. This can be brought in as well. So we can use modern technology to, and not to have this kind of revolution where we have to go out and fight them, because I think the bad guys would love that if it were to come to throwing stones in the streets. But this is more like saying, okay, you got your bad thing there, and we'll go along a little beside it with this convertibility for a while, but we're setting up interest-free money. And what I'd ask everyone here to do is get involved. You could get involved with what I'm doing, or get involved with what Jamie's doing, or whatever local interest-free currencies you see getting started, and of course talk to Paul about how the system works and what the different national solutions can be. But please get involved, because if we all just start getting into it now, we can actually do it. And I just want to say that there's a possibility, and that's why I've come into this idea. Like, I've got the social credit behind me, but it's a possibility of doing something practical.
Okay, the woman in the front has some question.
I just want to be in the different perspective, and I agree with Hannah, and I went to this talk with Anthony Mitchell, and it was really good. My question to you, no one here mentioned the fact that in Ireland, especially in Dublin, the role that national corporations are playing right now. I think it's kind of weird, because if you compare other countries like Germany or other countries where they have more national companies where like from their own country, perhaps this has influence. The reason I'm saying that is because at the moment, okay, let's say if you work for Google or one of these multinationals, okay, the way this is happening is that perhaps, okay, you can get a loan, you go to the bank and say, well, the loan based on this, based on that. But obviously, maybe the day after tomorrow something happens to, they move to Malaysia or they move to Poland because it's cheaper. And this, I'm just making a comparison, because in Spain, the banks were giving loans to people who, after 1 year, the economy in Spain collapsed. What people used to go is you go to the bank, get the keys back to the bank, and they disappear. There were many migrants from South America that they never came back. My question to you is that, what is the role that the multinationals and these big corporations are playing here, where last week, for example, Hewlett Packard announced that they're moving out of Dixie because whatever, many people are losing their jobs, and that if you are working for, let's say, Hewlett Packard, you have a loan, now you are stuck there because this company has promised you whatever, 20 years or whatever, your contract. My question to you is that I really agree with this, but in the current situation in Ireland, many of us are working here for whoever this company, and then you are being, I suppose, you are being told that you are safe. You go to your bank, the bank does a calculation, how much is your salary, and they give you out three times your salary. If I would have known that, I would have asked for a loan myself, and I would have gone to your assistant. But the question to you is that many people like me who are not aware until now. And my question to you is that, how can we challenge these multinationals who are supposed to be in Ireland for 1 year, 2 years, they decide to pull out of Ireland the next day, and all the people who are there are losing their jobs, and what happens with the law? Is there a kind of a moral responsibility of these companies who decide to come here, they get the money from the IDA, they don't pay the taxes for however many years, and when they are finished, all the people who are working there are...
Okay. Anybody have to say about that? Yeah, Jamie?
Yeah, one thing I forgot to say is I was up in Ardmore Island there over the weekend, and I went into the local coffee shop, and there's a lady running that, Dr. Shirley Gallagher, and she's introduced her own local currency to the island, which is backed by the euro. And she was telling me that all the kids are coming in, bringing home this currency. This is the currency they want to use, and they're bringing their parents in to buy it for them, and they're buying coffee and scones, whatever. And her business has doubled or trebled since she introduced this currency. And it wasn't a big job to do it, she did it in a matter of days.
Jamie, you wanted to come back on this question?
Yeah, just when you mentioned the big companies, that's a little what I was getting at when I was talking about imaginary people, because that's what the companies are. and it just means there's a lack of accountability, and a company, being an imaginary person, by definition can't feel anything for people. They don't feel sorry for people, so they pull out of countries and they leave people stranded. But what we would be suggesting is that somebody will be responsible, that there's no imaginary people. The company, whoever it is the person is responsible for in their company. And if they do something like that, because in my own opinion, companies, we don't actually really need multinational companies, because the only tax that most of them pay is the PAYE from the workers who live here. Most of their profits go abroad anyway. And we certainly don't need that, because if a big supermarket moves in next door, all the small traders shut down. So the equivalent amount of jobs that are lost, or even less maybe, are created. So that, they don't really add a whole lot to us. And I'd be arguing that that's a problem we have in society, which is kind of systemic at this point. But we're not going to tackle it overnight. But I think as regards currency, I don't see how the currency would affect companies like that. But I think currency, society and governance should be all one entity, because they overlap so much and they intertwine, they depend on each other. And I think that would address that problem.
Paul?
Well, I just want to say fundamentally the current system is inherently unstable, and it's this instability which ultimately leads to all the multinationals just jumping ship at a moment's notice. Now, if we had a more sensible monetary system, and one which didn't have this fundamental flaw of interest charged on money created, and as soon as people stop perpetually borrowing more and more, all of a sudden we run into problems, and we need this growth in the economy, perpetual growth forever and so on. If we didn't have those fundamental flaws, we would have a far more stable economy. And just if we had more state-created money, I think we would have a far more stable economy. And just I remember my own dad talking about having a job for life, so to speak. And ultimately, that was because he just did business in a world where far more of the money supply was debt-free money issued by the state. So I think rather than start trying to tackle why multinationals are leaving and so on, if we just fix the monetary system at its fundamental flaws, then those kind of problems would just naturally dissipate.
But isn't there this question though? I mean, you can approach this problem in a technical way, and you have to have, and then you can move right out into the zeitgeist. You can go into totally holistic kind of philosophy about what this model is, because it's an entirely different way of thinking. The problem is we're stuck in this kind of thinking which is normalized. The multinationals. I mean, it's extraordinary to me that we're talking half the day about austerity imposed upon ordinary, hard-working people who haven't money to fill their fridges with food, and yet there's this fetish about maintaining the 12.5% corporation tax, the lowest tax in Europe for multinational corporations. So on the one hand, massive taxes for the ordinary worker, minimum taxes for the corporations, and nobody thinks this is absurd or bizarre, and we're not even allowed to talk about it. Similarly, absurdities like Joan Burton goes on and she comes up, and nobody challenges this analysis where she says we can't even look at the social welfare system and the way it's stacked up because we need that money to circulate in the economy, because that creates economic activity and jobs and so on. And of course we're all kind of stuck in kind of ideological gridlock where people start to say, for other reasons, yeah, that's cool, because you don't want to jump on the unemployed or whatever. But what nobody says is that, what is this thing? If you pay somebody dough, it's not a handout, it's not compassion. You're actually paying them to be immobilized. You're giving them the minimum amount of compensation to withhold their talents and skills and genius from their community. So you're paying them to be stagnant. And we think that's a good thing. And it seems to me that the discussion, therefore, is completely bananas. So, with respect, I mean, the multinational thing is not the question. We need a society which doesn't need to be obsessed with multinationals. We need to have a society that needs to actually start thinking for itself, that the real genius, the real wealth of this country is in the hearts and minds and hands of its people. It's not in Google. Fuck Google. Well?
Yeah.
John.
Yes, James here.
The psychology of the Irish people sound very simplistic, but for me, like the three speakers there, they all have the ingredients there to completely evolve into a new way of thinking for everybody. And it is all about how we think. It's all imaginary, and interest is imaginary, banks are imaginary, Éire Bank is imaginary. It all depends on what way you want to look at the imaginary. Do you want to look at it in a community way, or do you want to look at it in a corporate, profit-driven way? So it starts with, is the community coming first? Is any new idea? Is corporate profit coming first? Which one is it? If you start with the point of when thinking it's purely about community, I'm still probably making a profit as long as the community comes first. The honour is gone in our society. That is the biggest problem. There's no honour. There's no honour in making profit. There's a very good YouTube documentary that everyone should look at on corporation. And in law, that corporate profit must come before everything else. Shareholder profit must come before absolutely everything else. That is the fact, it's reality. It came from America, it came from the corporate personhood in the 1890s. The Supreme Court in America, they ruled that corporations had the same rights as people. And that was a mutation in humanity in that moment of time, which is spread around the globe. With none of the liabilities.
Thanks, James. What I'll do is, thanks. We're coming towards the end, so we have one more speaker from the floor, and then I'll ask each of the speakers to wrap up from their point of view. And I mean, tonight was never going to be the last word; it's the first word, maybe, for this room and for lots of other rooms, hopefully in the future in this country. But if anybody else from the floor would like to say something at this point, yes, the gentleman.
No, I've just been very disturbed recently to see Richie Boucher being interviewed at rar.ie News. He was launching his bank's campaign against families unleashing illegal repossessions. And in that interview he said that the money they loaned people for mortgages during the health crisis was other people's money, and that had to be repaid. Now, was he lying? I said as much on Facebook, but I kind of waited.
No, he absolutely was, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Now, I just have two more things to say. Fractional reserve banking. Were the banks operating under fractional reserve banking during those years?
Well,
and if so, why, if banks create money, why do they have to go to the international markets to borrow?
Okay, well, we have a document which explains all of that. It's called, for there's sort of a lay person's guide called How Banks Create and Destroy Money, and it explains all your questions there. There's a more technical one as well, how money is created and destroyed. And that explains exactly what's going on there. So actually we have a two-tier monetary system. I won't go into it in too much detail, but banks deal with central bank money. So if you transfer money from AIB to Bank of Ireland, for example, the transaction actually happens at the central bank. So that's why banks need central bank money. So when you hear about them going off to the markets and borrowing money from German banks and so on, that's the type of money that they're talking about. And now they do need a little bit of this money in case lots of people transfer money from one bank to another at short notice and so on. Now the rest of us deal with a different type of money. We deal with bank account money, and this is the bank's liabilities. So in accounting terms, your bank account is a liability, so if they increase it, their liabilities go up, and that's the type of money that we use. So yeah, Richie Boucher was definitely lying. It's not other people's money, the banks just create the money they lend. On the fractional reserve banking end of things, we don't actually have textbook fractional reserve banking, as in we don't have banks taking 100 euros in, keeping 10 euros aside and lending out 90. So we do have fractional reserve banking in the sense that banks have an account at the central bank called the reserve account. It has certain numbers in it, and they're only a fraction of what they have on their loan book. But we don't have textbook fractional reserve banking. So banks were practicing this kind of modern version of fractional reserve banking, I suppose.
Okay. Has any of this been dealt with in the group? Any of the reports written on the banking crisis? Is any of this discussed in any increasing detail?
No, and I get on to all the authors of the various reports that are written, and point out just really technical things like, you're suggesting here that the money came from other people's savings and so on. That's just not true. And I just get polite, or we'll take your concern on board kind of thing, emails back. But no, they're not really dealt with. The monetary system is very misunderstood.
So, the role of the regulator would be to make clear what the parameters of the framework within which banks could expand credit, I presume.
Yeah.
Now, were they breached and what were they? Is that much clearer?
There's been a few different papers written on this. The idea goes that if the central bank wants to stimulate the economy, they can flood banks with this central bank money. And at that stage, the banks are meeting all their minimum reserve requirements, they're meeting their minimum liquidity requirements and so on. And they're in a healthy position to expand their loan book. Now, in reality, it works the other way around. If you go into a bank and organise a loan, they don't say, look, come back to me on Tuesday. I have to get the central bank to create a portion of this money in central bank money first. And so realistically, they just make the loan. And at that stage, they're under pressure then to look for the reserve account money. And if the central bank gets a request for reserve account money, they're not really in a position to refuse. They'd be accused of potentially causing a financial crisis or holding back growth and so on. So the system really works in reverse, where banks first of all create the money and then they look for the reserves afterwards.
Okay, Jamie, would you like to wrap up?
Yeah, I just wanted to, just a point on what that man has said there. Our proposal with Éire Bank is that we need to think differently about what the problems are. And basically, for anybody who's maybe run a business, if you've ever done financial projections, you'll know how easy it is to make the figures work. And with that in mind, you just have to think, if 97% of our money is digital, why can't the banks just fix it?
James?
Yeah, just one thing there, and it refers back to this gentleman here who's talking about the corporate issue versus the personal perspective. Most people think that when they put their money into a deposit account, that it's safe. You're actually investing your money with the bank. That's why you get an interest rate, and you put your money at risk. And most people don't realise that the corporate entity gets preference over your money, whereas a current account, they can't touch it, but you get no interest rate on it. There's a slight little technical difference that most people don't realise, and it affects us when we're investing money as well.
Colin, would you like to wrap up?
Yeah, well, just to say that what I already said, that it's possible now to start these currencies. There's technology here now that wasn't there before. We don't have to use cut-up playing cards, and we can be a little bit more sophisticated than that. But I do feel it's a real opportunity for us now to just get it going, because you see, the problem about this meeting here is we're talking about it, which is great, and we're increasing our understanding, but we're all going to go out now and we're going to put our hand, go into Centra or whatever, and put our hand into our pockets and take out euros and spend them and just feed the beast in that way, just by using that. But there's coming up opportunities to get involved with these local interest-free currencies and get something started. The other thing I would say is that I think Ireland's in a historical position, because if we did something here in Ireland, it wouldn't have to be, like, it's not like it's America or all of Europe that we have to change, which I think is very difficult to make an impact in a country with 300 or 400 million people. We've got a country here that's only the size of like Birmingham or something, or Manchester in terms of the number of people, but it still has, and maybe not for long, but it still has the impact globally of a nation. So I think that's a really big opportunity, and there's great goodwill towards Ireland around the world. So if we start doing something a little bit different, I think we can have great influence, and I think it's time to do it.
Yeah. I think the important thing is to have thoughts and trust them. You know, everybody who deals with money, who works, who tries to live, who tries to make the money go around, understands the problem in some way. Just because you can't put it into the correct lingo to be on RTE doesn't mean that you don't understand the problem. And some of the times you have intuitions which actually can cut to the core of it. Trust them. Talk to other people about it. That's the thing. I mean, you know, it struck me there, I was in a restaurant watching people eat one night, and it struck me that there's something about cutlery, you know, that, and I wrote this, forgive me if you've read the article, but you know, imagine if you saw a documentary tonight on your TV when you went home about a race of people in some foreign country who were starving, who were completely emaciated, distended bellies and so on. And they were destitute and poverty-stricken, hungry. And then the voice of the reporter came on and explained that the reason for this was that they had no cutlery, that the government had taken their cutlery and given it away to a foreign government. Therefore they couldn't eat. How much sense would that make? What's actually going on is quite analogous to that. Because the only thing that's missing from us, from our community, from our society, is the use of this instrument. The effective use of this instrument, which is money, is supposed to be. And that's all it is. It has no intrinsic value. It's just an instrument, a tool to take your talents, to exchange them with mine, to exchange the things that you want to exchange with the things that I might have to give you, and so on. That's all it is. And these people have appropriated this tool and refused to give it back to the people who actually own it. Now, it's really, that sounds really simplistic, and the economists will tell you it's simplistic, but that's in essence what's going on. And we've got to start from those kinds of intuitions, those kinds of insights, and build up. So trust each other. You know, lots of people are out there, we live in the internet age, lots of people have skills that are going to be useful in the future with all this. There's no reason why Ireland couldn't be the place, as Colin says, that this starts. It's big enough and small enough to make a model that could work elsewhere. So let's get to it. Let's hope we have other evenings like this. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for listening.
We're arranging a forum on public banking for the second week of October, and if it's okay, would it be, if anyone wants to go to it or be notified of it, if you pass the sheet around with your email addresses, I see that you get an email when we have it organised. We'll probably also hold a venue in Limerick and one in Cork as well.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, John. And we get a sheet there and we stick it, we put it up here, and do you have a spare page there?
Well, I got one there. Well, then you
No,
have
no
two
singing,
to sign.
no singing. Thank you all for coming, and enjoy the rest of the evening.
Can I just add, John, I have some books here on interest-free money, and I have an email sign up for Fair Money. Just kind of wants to look at those or sign that. Thanks.
Great. Okay, thank you.